Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa nashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika la wa nashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Inshallah, what I want to do following our series on Surah Al-Kahf, I want to build a platform that will enable you to go into the Quran now in a much more deeper sense and not the superficial sense of just reading the Quran in the Arabic. And I want to do this by using the Arabic language, explaining what the Arabic language is in light of the Quran. I'm not going to get into the semantics of the language and the grammatical rules and the expanse of the vocabulary and all that. This is not a lugha, a darsul lugha. I'm going to try and explain the essence of language itself, speech and communication and articulation, as well as the essence of the Arabic language from the Quran. And what I want to do, inshallah, is I'm going to go into Surah Al-Fatiha first, and then I'm going to go into Surah Yasin, because Surah Fatiha is the opening of the Quran. Surah Yasin is regarded as the heart of the Quran. So I want to do that. I want to go into the opening and then into the heart and then expand from there, inshallah. I'm also going to build on a series already done by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, which he did last year in Ramadan. It's about a 7-session series titled The Gateway to God's Book. It's an amazing series, and I would encourage you to take a look at that, and not just take a look at in terms of just listening to the lecture as an entertainment. The benefit is that these are pre-recorded sessions, so you can pause the video, and I would advise you do that. Take your notes, look up the terminologies that he's giving, look up the ayat that he's quoting. It's an amazing series. So I'm going to expand on that series and then go into Surah Al-Fatiha and Surah Yasin. The overall objective of this is to give you an understanding of the language from the essential point of view rather than the semantic point of view. Because the semantic point of view is a lot more difficult if you don't understand why you need to learn the language. Because a lot of Muslims hold the argument that you don't need to learn Arabic to be a good Muslim, and the argument is valid. You don't need to learn Arabic to be a good Muslim. But if you want to fulfill your overall obligation as a Muslim to understand the Book of Allah and the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, you have to learn the Arabic language. There's no other alternative. But if you just go haphazardly into learning Arabic the way it is taught in modern institutions, what you call modern standard Arabic, you're going to lose yourself, because a lot of the expressions and terminologies used are essentially coming from modern West or modern civilization, from our modern cultural point of view. It's what they have projected of their own thinking into the Arabic language rather than learning the Arabic language the way the Arabs themselves understood it. And for that, one needs to look at the language from its essential point of view. Everything in creation has got a physical tangibility and then a qualitative intangibility, or a metaphysical aspect of it, is to look at the language from a metaphysical point of view. Now, the origin of language, the origin of Arabic, the scholars say that they all agreed that Arabic was a language of tawqifiyah. It's something that didn't just come out through arbitration. There wasn't a group of people who decided which words to use and how to pronounce them and what they would mean and what their connections are. It's not a conventional concoction of a language. The scholars say that this is something that was imbued. It was something that was set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if you trace the roots back, not the semantic roots, the meanings of the words used in Arabic, if you trace those roots back, you will actually arrive at the first language spoken by mankind, the language spoken by Adam alayhi salam. Because the meanings come from outside the world of physicality. And this is something I'll explain, inshallah, how this actually works. Because from a modern linguistic point of view, they tend to apply their entire analysis of language based on their analysis of the creation of the human being. So there are two theories, dominant theories, evolution or creation. And much of their reasoning is not done from an Arabic point of view. It's done from an English point of view. Now, English is a good language if it is used properly. But English is also a very slippery language, right? Because it follows a linearity of syntax, a certain order. That order can be manipulated. That linearity can be manipulated to provide a different kind of meaning or to imply something else. And the rhetoric of English is very dangerous, which is why you see sometimes on pure argumentative points, a person convicted of a crime like murder can easily get acquainted on a technicality because of the way the lawyer perhaps reasoned his case. Now, what they say of the Arabic language, the way they project or look at the Arabic language, they don't look at it from the way the Arabs looked at the language. And what they project of it is their own linearity of thinking. What you would call East versus West. So the East thinks in a different way and the West thinks in a different way. Why? Because the dominant language is spoken by these peoples, different peoples, define how they see the world. It influences their thinking. Language influences thought. And then thought results in cultivation, because what you're thinking, your ideas are then implemented into your actions. And the actions of an entire people collectively builds their civilization. So culture eventually results in civilization. So if you want to understand a civilization, you have to understand it in the language they speak. If you want to understand the Arab people, you have to understand them in the language they speak. If you want to understand modern Western civilization, you have to understand them in the language they speak. And I'm not talking about the semantics of the language. I'm talking about how they view that language. What meaning do they derive from the words that they use? If you look at the word reality from the Latin word reas, which is where English draws most of its roots from. English is a ragtag collection of different languages, Germanics and French and Latin and Greek. Reality is something they draw from the Latin language, which from the word reas. Now in Latin, the word reas means thing or matter or property or good. So in that concept right there, you can see embedded in the meaning of the word reality is a sense of material reality, not a sense of spiritual reality. But if you look at the Arabic language, reality does not mean thing. Thing has a different word. It means shay'un. Reality means haqiqa, which comes from al-haq. So in the Arabic language, from the Arabic point of view, reality is something attributed to spirituality as a spiritual reality. Now in the English language, you can't just say reality. You have to clarify what you're saying. There's a disambiguity there. You have to clarify whether it's material reality you're talking about or spiritual reality you're talking about. And then from the modern scientific point of view, in their language, you have to prove material reality and spiritual reality. How do you prove spiritual reality? It's very easy to prove material reality. From the Arabic point of view, Arabic is a very precise language. But in its precision, there's a wide expanse of descriptives. The Arabic vocabulary is more vast than the English vocabulary. The specificity is that spiritual reality has the word haqiqa, and then material reality has a different word. Al-waqi'iyya, we say, is factual reality. Things that happen, these are material realities. There's a vast difference between the two types of thinking. One is a very quantitative kind of thinking, and the Arabic language is a very qualitative kind of thinking. which is why it is given that designation or recognition of being tawqifiyah, because the quality of the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not quantitative revelation. You're not given numbers and equations. It's not mathematical revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's purely qualitative. And the Arabic language is best suited for that qualitative revelation. What modern linguists say about this is based on how they define the creation of the human being, because language is now related to the human being from the human being's point of view. There's no other creature that speaks. The jinn speak, but we're not talking about the jinn right now. We're talking about al-hayawan in the animal kingdom. The human being is the only creature that speaks. That doesn't mean that the rest of creation doesn't communicate. Everything is in constant communication. But the human being is al-hayawan natiq, an articulating animal, the speaking animal. So it depends on, if you want to know how this speaking came about, you have to understand what is the origin of the human being. So it's either an evolutionary theory or a creationary theory. Now, it's based on how they reason either one out. So in English, you can have two statements. I can say, he dropped the glass and it broke. He dropped the glass and the glass broke. Or I can say, the glass fell and broke. Right? Between these two sentences, who can tell me what the difference is? What do you think the difference is between the two sentences? The first sentence, he dropped the glass and it broke. And the second sentence, the glass fell and broke. What's the difference between the two?
The second one, it fell on its own.
Right.
The first one, somebody made it happen.
Right. The second one insinuates accident. The first one insinuates intent, an action, right? Now, if this was brought before a court, before a judge, the second one, because the initial cause cannot be established. So the conclusion is that this was an accident. It was a mistake. The conventional use of the term accident is directly synonymous to mistake, which is the wrong conclusion as far as language is concerned.
Other piece is responsibility.
Responsibility, exactly.
The second one, there is no responsibility. There's no accountability.
Right, but there's the initial, because the initial cause is not established, right? The glass broke, that's the effect. What was the cause? It fell. But then what caused it to fall? We don't know. So it was an accident, it was a mistake. But in the first instance, the initial cause is established. He dropped it. Whether it is a mistake or it was done intentionally is an after the fact matter, established after the fact. So accident doesn't mean mistake. Now this is on a micro level. If you apply the same concept to a macro level, a cosmological level, I can say he created everything, or everything was created, just by removing the he portion from the sentence. Now you can see how they derive their meanings and their understandings, because everything was created doesn't show you what the initial cause was. But then he created everything shows you who the originator of the cause was. Now, if you look at the Quran, you will not find in the Quran anywhere a statement that says everything was created. You will always see خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Allahu khalaqa as-samawati wal ard. Now, in the Arabic language, a base rule of the Arabic language, one of the rules is that كل فعل يحتاج إلى فاعل. Every action must have the person or someone doing the action. So in the root construct of the Arabic verbs, the root construct compared to the English, in English you say a verb is to come or to go, right? But in the Arabic, the root construct doesn't mean to come or to go. ذهب means he came, right? خرج means he left, he exited. The root construct of the verb in Arabic always starts off with the third person singular. There is always somebody who did the action. An action doesn't just occur. So in the essence of the language itself, there is a sense of responsibility. There is a sense of things don't just happen at random. Something is always responsible. There's always a reason for why things happen. So if you think in the English language, then it's very easy for you to see the world of causality as a world of accidentals only, as a world of mistake and spontaneity. If you think in the Arabic language, then you see the world in a different sense. Even though they were pagan Arabs, they didn't have a religion, they didn't have Islam at the time, they still had a sense of that spirituality. They still had some sense, a fitra sense, that there is more than just what they see in the material world, more than just the physical aspects. So based on these two analyses, when they look at the theory of evolution, they will attribute the contingency, when they go from now, going back to the contingency of saying where does language originate from, because they can't establish the original cause, they will say language is an evolutionary part of the brain. It just happened because humans needed to point and grunt or ding dong. These are the theories modern linguists supply. Origin of language, ding dong theory, right? Things are named based on how they sound. And that's there in the Arabic language, but it's a very small portion, right? Asma'ul Sawt, the names of things of sound, of how things sound. Or point and grunt, like just, point and I want that thing. So that's how language originated. And this is the fallacy of their reasoning. It's why they cannot come to an existential understanding of why we speak, why we think. But if you look at the creationary aspect of how the human being was created, from the very beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it in the Quran. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, that He, Allah, taught. Allama is in the modern, one of the modern definitions is teaching, is He taught, right? He taught. But in the earlier definitions, it was He imprinted. Going back in the word itself, going back to its Syriania roots, because they didn't have writing at that time. They didn't teach the way we are teaching. It was an imprinting. You imprint into the child what the child should know. So it was an imprinting that was done into the human being, that He taught Adam the names of all. And I'll explain what that names of all means. But He also says, Ar-Rahman, Allama al-Quran, Khalaqa al-Insan, Allamahu al-Bayan. It starts, the Quran's, the Surah Rahman starts by telling you who is performing that action first. Ar-Rahman, the merciful one. Allama al-Quran. He taught. You're already being shown who is doing the action. He taught the Quran. Khalaqa al-insan, He created the human being. Allamahu al-bayan, and there is a pronoun in between there. Allamahu al-bayan, He taught the human being, because the who goes back to insan. And you see this dynamic in the Arabic language, it's very interesting. He taught the human being articulation. He taught the human being articulation. Now if you look at how the construct of those ayat are, the prior ayah starts with وَإِذْ قَالَ, and when he said Rabbuka, your Lord. So the person who is saying has been shown who it is. وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً, I'm going to place on the earth a successor of what? Of His knowledge, not His sovereignty, His knowledge. قَالَ أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا, so who is the qala being referred to? Because the initial qala was referred to Rabbuka, but this qala is now in reference to al-malaika, the angels. So they asked, qalu, not qala, qalu أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَا يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَفْسِكُ الدِّمَاءَ وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ, are you going to place someone who's going to cause bloodshed and corruption? Then comes again qala. Now this is referring back to Allah, and you see this dynamic in the Quran. It moves between time and space. It is not static. It's a very dynamic language. In English, you can't say that. You cannot use that same flow. Because in English, for example, if you look at the Ar-Rahman portion, Ar-Rahman, Allama al-Quran, Khalaqa al-Insan, Allamahu al-Bayan, you can translate that. the merciful one. He taught the Quran. He created the human being. Now, if you look at the fourth ayah, Allamahul Bayan, if you translate that, it says, it would be, he taught him. Articulation. In English grammar, proper grammar, you can't say that. You can't say he taught him. He taught who? You have to bring the insan back into the new sentence. You have to start a new structure. You can't go backward. In English language, you have to go forward. You can't revert back in time or space. So if you're saying he taught him, you have to specify who that him is, because it could imply that he taught himself. It could imply that he taught him. It could imply that he taught himself. You can't do that in the English language, but you can do it in Arabic. You can have this dynamic shift through time and space. Now, if you think in the Arabic language, because when we conceptualize form, we use words. We don't actually think in forms. We build forms in our minds, but we have to describe those forms for that to make sense to ourselves internally. So we use words. So we always think in words. We don't realize this, but this is what we do. This is the human being. We reason it out in our minds. We use words. Now, if you use the English language when you're doing your thinking, then you will be very linear and very, very quantitative. So it suffices in some aspects of thinking. But if you were to think in the Arabic language, you would actually have a dynamic range. It would be an expanse of your thinking. Umar ibn Khattab said, تعلم العربية. I wrote it down somewhere. Okay, I can't find it. تعلم العربية فإنه تزيد العقل. He said, learn the Arabic language because it expands your intellect. It expands your intelligence because of its dynamic range and its expansive vocabulary and its pinpoint precision and the way it is structured. Everything can be traced back to root origins. And this is, if you look at this in terms of a cosmological reflection, the human being is designed in the same way. The Arabic language is a cosmological language. It's a reflection of the cosmos. The human being in the expanse of human civility can always be traced back to root origins. Everything in creation can be traced back to root origins. The microcosm is a reflection of the macrocosm, right? If you look at the solar system and the planets and the revolution of the planets, it is reflective of the atom in the smallest sense. You've got the nucleus and electrons, orbiting the nucleus. It's a reflection. So the language itself defines how you view reality. If you're only going to look at it in the linear sense, then you will only see a series of causes and effects. And you can't attribute a prior effect to a prior effect to a cause in the future sense. You can't go back and forth in that way. You have to go systematically in an algorithm. You have to literally go flow by flow, line by line. This speech and articulation of the human being, it's a unique phenomenon. So the first question intelligently a person would ask when they look at something, an object, to want to know what that object is they will want to know what that object is called. So when you meet someone, you don't ask them who they are. You ask them what is their name. It's more polite and courteous to ask them what is their name. You don't say man anta, right? Who are you? You ask ma ismuk, what is your name? Because when you know the name of the person, then you've got an opening into knowing who that person is. But you ask him, what is your name? These are two separate things. The you and the name are two separate things. Because you are not your name. Your name is something that is just attributed to you. You're not Nabil as the name Nabil. Nabil is your name. It's your identity. Right? You're not Shafi. Because if you look at the meaning of Shafi, it means healing. You're not healing, but that's an attribute that has been given to you as a sort of identity. And this is what we do with everything in creation. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا means that he taught Adam all the names. And that knowing of all the names gives the human being the ability to take the name and then to attribute it to the object. And once the connection has been made, even when that object is removed from your from your perspective, you can't see it anymore. Just by recalling the name, you can recall the form in memory. You can think about it, and that's called conceptualization. You now have a concept of the thing. But whatever you call that thing doesn't change what it is. So you can call this book, right? This object, you can call it book. But I can call it kitab. Now whether you say book or kitab doesn't change what this is. Somebody can come along and call it water. Doesn't make it water, does it? It's still a book. It's still what it is. It doesn't change what it is. So the name is not the thing itself. Now the human being is somewhere in between these two things. The names, all the names, and all that is created. He's in between these two things. So you have the ism and the musamma. And this is an interesting dynamic in the Arabic language. You will see things like, those who are learning Arabic, you will see things like mudafun, mudafun alayh. You will see an-na'at wal-man'ut. You will see as-sifa wal-mawsuf, right? You all see this dynamic of connecting one to the other. So if I say Rasulullah, the messenger of Allah, the Rasul is mudaf. The word Rasul is mudaf. The word Allah is mudafun ilayh. So the Rasul is possessed by Allah. It is Allah's messenger. This is the connection being done. You've got adad wal ma'dud, the count and then the thing that is counted. So the number is not the same as the object. The quantity is not the same as the quality, right? The name is not the same as the thing that is named. But in between the two, you've got the act of naming. And this is what the human being does. He associates names to the objects in order to understand them. And this in logic is called naive perception, asking, what is it? Ma hiya, what is it? Right? Naive perception, tasawwur sadij, what is it? This is the first step that you do, because then you can go into the descriptives and the definitions and the explanations and the interpretation, and you expand from there on. But it starts from that initial point. This is what is meant by وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Adam alayhi salam was not a list of vocabulary. He gave Adam alayhi salam the ability to link the name to the object and whatever object he will see and study. So the more you study, and in vocabulary, words themselves have got other words to describe them. So language is in its nature, number one, it is ambiguous, but it is also metaphoric in and of itself. Every word has another word describing it. When we speak, we're always speaking in metaphors. We're not speaking in literal aspects. We're always describing something else, right? Now, these descriptions then ultimately come into the human being. So when you have now the conceptualization, depending on how you have conceptualized that item, it now builds and shapes your thoughts and your thinking and your ideas. That eventually comes out into the real world. And inshallah, next session I'll explain how the language actually comes out from its essence into the real world. How does this process actually work? Where does speech actually originate from? If you look at the Arabic language, you find that the Arabic language, because it is tawqifiyah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself has preserved the Arabic language. And the preservation of the Arabic language has ensured the preservation of the Quran. It says in Surah Al-Hijr, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun." Indeed, we have sent down this Quran, this remembrance, this dhikr. Remembrance of who? Of him. Because the Quran is itself, it is a compendium of signs, but in and of itself it is a sign. And a sign always points to something else. And it is sent down from him, so it is a sign that points to him, remembrance of him. And he says, and indeed we have preserved it. This preservation of the word of Allah is something that previous civilizations had been given as a task, a responsibility, just like the Arabs. The Arabs were given the same responsibility. The Arabs succeeded in that responsibility because of the inspiration that they were given from Allah. Well, I'll explain that when we come to revelation itself. What does revelation mean? The previous civilizations were given an equal responsibility, but they failed at that responsibility. The Jews had their first lexicography in the 9th century, 300 years after Islam, and 3,000 years after the Torah was revealed to them. They didn't have a dictionary until then. They saw what the Arabs were doing and they thought, oh, we should have done this a long time ago. And this was one of the discrepancies in the issues it's because of their own ineptitude that they ended up corrupting, because the nature of the soul is that it does corrupt in the world of causality. And they ended up corrupting the word of Allah. Because you can transmit the ayah orally of the Quran. You can transmit it orally. And this is how when we teach our children, we don't teach them to read the Quran first. We teach them to recite the Quran first. This is naturally imprinted in us as Muslims, and it's part of our tradition that the Quran was not revealed in scripted form. It was revealed in a recitative form. It was recited by the Prophet ﷺ to the Sahaba. So this is how we teach our children. But the problem with that teaching is, if the rules are not established, if the proper Arabic is not understood, and I'm not only talking about the tajweed, I'm also talking about the grammatical aspects of it, then what you end up doing is, because practice doesn't just make perfect, it makes permanent. If you've got mistakes and you keep practicing the same mistakes, they become permanent. You end up having a distortion over time. And this distortion can change the meaning of the word of Allah completely. I'll give you an example, a common mistake that we do of Surah Al-Kawthar. When we recite Surah Al-Kawthar, we say, Inna a'tainaka al-Kawthar. Alright? Now, if I was to ask you to break that down for me, how many words are in that? What are the different words in that ayah? What do you think? What are the different words in that ayah? Inna a'tainaka al-Kawthar. 4 words? Inna, and then? Uh-huh. No, see, so there are actually 3 words. Because the ka, the ka is an attached pronoun. It is not a ka of similitude. So a lot of people, when they recite it, they break the ka from the a'taina. But that changes the meaning entirely, because inna a'tainaka means we have given you, we have granted you al-Kawthar, yeah? You had something?
No.
Okay. He's saying we have granted, indeed, inna is emphatic, is tawqid. Inna, we have granted you. The ka is attached to the verb. A'tainaka, we have granted you al-Kawthar. Al-Kawthar is a separate item by itself. But when we recite it, we tend to shift the ka from the a'taina to the Kawthar. So what we end up saying is, wa na'udhu billah, we end up saying we have given us something like al-Kawthar, because it becomes kal-Kawthar, like al-Kawthar. And the ka is removed, so it becomes we have given us something like al-Kawthar. See, this is a problem, because now you've changed the word of Allah. And if you keep on transmitting that over 3,000 years, what do you end up having? Nothing. You end up having something that you've constantly manipulated, and they ended up manipulating a lot of things in their scriptures based on what suited them. Because somebody would just look at what was written by hand and say, oh, I think he made a mistake. This dot should not be here. So he removes that dot because of his own subjective understanding of what is being said. And now he's changed the meaning entirely. And then the next person does something similar to the same thing. So ultimately what you have is meaning lost. You might have the words and the characters and the harf and everything there, but the meanings are lost. Now this was imperative because the Muslims experienced this firsthand. Somebody one of the companions of Ali radiallahu anhu heard somebody reciting an ayah of the Quran. Now that inna a'tayna was just a very simple example. It's a much lower magnitude. There are some parts of the Quran that are tremendous and they can go into extreme blasphemy. He heard somebody reciting from Surah Tawbah, the ayah which says, Anna Allaha bari'un minal mushrikina wa rasuluhu. That's the correct ayah, the way it is. But because in the early scripted forms, the tashkil were not put into the writings. So you had to know Arabic grammar in order to recite it properly, because without the tashkil, you can make a big mistake. So he heard somebody reciting it the wrong way. What the ayah is saying is that indeed Allah has disassociated himself from the mushrikeen, and so has his messenger. Yani his messenger has also disassociated himself from the mushrikeen. So Allah has disassociated and his messenger has also disassociated. But this person who was reciting it made a monumental mistake in the grammatical error of switching the dhamma into a kasra. He made it genitive in the grammar. And he ended up saying wa rasulihi. So turning the Rasul from his own intent into an object. And ended up saying that Allah, wa na'udhu billahi min hadha, he ended up saying Allah has disassociated himself from the mushrikeen and his messenger. Implying that, because the waw then becomes a waw of summation in between. So collectively putting the mushrikeen and the Rasul in one category, you can see that is a very, very crucial, very critical error. Because now you've uttered a sense of blasphemy. And this is utterance, this is part of speech. What you say has got impacts, has got repercussions. What you say has got repercussions. And inshallah, there's just a bit left. I'm just going to conclude with this. So what the Jews ended up doing now, if you want to understand what is Zionism, what is the American Revolution, what is modern Western civilization, you have to first understand what is the truth. Then you can analyze what is the lie. Because it is imbibed. A lie in construct, in speech, a lie cannot stand on its own. If a lie is purely concocted, it will vanish. Falsehood by its nature, Allah said, falsehood by its nature is bound to perish. So for a lie to stand, it has to be concocted with something of the truth. There has to be something there to hold it together. So you need to know what is the truth for you to break down the lie, the deception. So when you say that we should discuss about these things, this is why I wanted, instead of going into those semantic discussions first, understand what is the litmus test. Because then you can easily decode that. When you understand what language really is, you'll be able to understand how they think and what is their cultivation. So why are they doing what they are doing, right? So the Jews, and this is a requisite also for the Muslim, because for you to be a good Muslim, you don't need to know the Arabic language. You can be a good Muslim. So long as you understand what you're doing, you understand what the kalima means. But for you to fulfill your obligation as a Muslim, for you to complete that process, Muslim is not just, 5 minutes kalima and I'm Muslim. No, that's not Muslim. Muslim is a lifelong endeavor. So for you to complete that obligation, you have to learn the Arabic language. Because the preservation of the Quran is done in the Arabic language. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Yusuf and in Surah Zukhruf, Inna nazzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyan la'allakum ta'akilun. And in Surah Zukhruf he says, Inna ja'alnahu Qur'anan Arabiyan la'allakum ta'akilun. We have sent it down, this Quran, as an Arabic Quran. We have placed it as an Arabic Quran. Why? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. So that you can think, you can reason, you can intellect and understand. And the preservation of the Quran has been done through the preservation of the Arabic language. The preservation of the Quran and the preservation of the Hadith. And you have to know the Hadith as well. Because you cannot understand the Quran without the Hadith. The Prophet ﷺ's life was an exemplification of the Quran. Aisha radiallahu anha said, "Kana khuluquhu al-Quran." His character was the Quran. He lived in accordance to what the Quran was. So you have to understand the hadith. Now, if you look at the hadith, the Arabic of the hadith is completely different from the Quran. Hadith is more difficult to understand, much more difficult to understand. It is an expansive vocabulary. The Quran has a lower vocabulary, a smaller vocabulary compared to the hadith. Hadith science is much more difficult. But if you look at the speech of the hadith, it has the same tajweed as the Quran, meaning that purity of the language of the hadith is the same as the purity of the language of the Quran. You can't go in there with just modern standard understanding of the Arabic language. So the Arabic language is something that is attributed to the Quran. You cannot separate the Arabic from the Quran. It's an attributed and it's an ordained matter. In the same way that you cannot separate Allah's attributes from Allah. You can't say He is not merciful. You just cannot do that. It won't work, and you can't even prove it. There's no reasoning. There's no outcome in which you can say that He is not what His attributes say He is. You can't separate the two. The Arabic is part and parcel of the Quran. You cannot separate the two. And the ordainment is such, when we looked at Surah Al-Kahf, there was an ayah, وَاتْلُوا مَا أُوهِيَ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ كِتَابِ رَبِّكَ. Recite what has been revealed unto you from your Lord's book. And then he says, لَا مُبَدِّلَ لِكَلِمَاتِ. There is no change in his speech, in his words. There is no change. So the Arabic is there. There is absolutely no way that you can go into the Quran from any other language. You can do a translation of just the script. You can translate the script, but to understand the Quran, you have to do it in the language it was revealed in, because it will formulate your thinking in accordance to the language and how the language itself is thought out. If you look at it from the English, you will be looking at the Quran from a linear perspective, and the Quran is not a linear book. It is a non-linear book, which is why Orientalists have a very difficult time looking at the Quran. They can't make sense of things because the Quran keeps doing this dynamic shift. It will shift from third person to first person. It will shift from plural to singular. It will keep doing this shifting and this change in even in time and space. It will talk about something in the future and then revert back to the past and then come back into the present and then do it again going into the past. It will keep on doing this. You can't do that in the English language. So if you're going to look at the translation of the Quran, it won't make any sense to you. And you can do that. You can look up Quran.com, which is an excellent source. You will find the different translations there. But if you read the translations, you won't get anything. Most of the ayah will look very repetitive. And this is a veil. Because for you to go into the Quran, you have to go into the Quran in a sense of understanding the Quran, not just reading it. You have to do it by the heart. Right? And it will seal itself from you if you go in there from a superficial point of view. And superficial includes just reading it without really understanding what you're reading, or just rogue memorization without really knowing what you're memorizing. So the preservation of the Quran was done by the Arabic language. And if you compare the other civilizations and the distortions that occurred with their, and by the way, these are all different languages that Allah had chosen for that time and place to reveal the Quran. So there are languages like the Sanskrit language, the Chinese language, the Hebrew language, not Latin per se. Latin has also got its own source origin, and there's a scholastic debate as to whether or not the Romans had at one point received revelation or in their root sources. But the Quran does say that every nation was sent a messenger. Now, whether every nation was given revelation like a full compendium of scriptures or part of the Lawh al-Mahfuz is a debatable matter. The same applies to the Greeks, but something of that nature in in their study to recognize the expanse of knowledge that these people had, it's difficult not to see a sense of revelation embedded somewhere in there. Because for a people to arrive at existential matters have to be revealed unto them. You cannot just go through rationality, a simple human rationality, to arrive at existential matters. And when you look at the knowledges of the Greeks and the Romans in the early senses, in the really root origins, it's hard not to see revelation imbibed in there. If you look at the Bible is something whose meanings are completely lost. Completely lost. I don't care what anyone says. I've got nothing against Christians personally. I think Christians are very good people. And they are closest to the Muslims, as the Quran says, closest to the Muslims than any other people in the world. But as far as the scriptures are concerned, and if you look at the distortions in their understanding of what scriptures really are and what the religion really entails, they have this distortion in it. This is where the concepts of Trinity and all because these are misinterpretations. The Bible from the very beginning was not preserved in the source language. From the very beginning. At least the Jews tried it. They tried to maintain it in the Hebrew language, and they went through their own distortions. But the Bible from the very get-go, its translation into Greek, and then its translation into Latin, and then its translation into Old English, and then its translation, so that you've got this, 4th edition and 5th edition, and this version, New James Version and Old James Version, and it's just ridiculous. And now you've got people who are trying to derive and interpret meanings on the latest edition, which is something that has lost its essence from the very beginning. So all you're getting is semantic words, and those words can mean anything. If you want to look at a word, you will look at the English dictionary of what that word means. You'll find so many definitions. Which one are you going to use? How will you put things into perspective as to what is Jesus saying? Because that's not what Jesus was saying. That's not what God was saying himself, right? So in the Bible, you will never find the gospel of Jesus. You ask any Christian to show you the gospel of Jesus, they can't do it. You will find the gospel according to someone. It's nobody's gospel. It's the gospel according to so-and-so, the gospel according to John, the gospel according to Mark. It's according to these people who heard what Jesus was saying, and they put their own interpretives in there, because the original transcription was never done when revelation was coming to Jesus, to Isa alayhi salam. So revelation in terms of the Injil itself, you'll only find traces of it in the Bible. But the Bible is not the Injil. Biblios is just a book from the Greek origin. That's what Biblios means. So those who are doing like your dissertations and stuff, you put a bibliography. What does bibliography mean? You're putting a compendium of which books you used. That's what Biblios means. Biblios means book. In the same way that Kitab means book. Kitab and Quran are two different things. We'll look at that in the future, in the next sessions. Kitab and Quran are two different things. So Bible and gospel are two different things. So the gospel is what's not there. The Bible is there. And there are many different compendiums in there. When you look at the Torah is there. And the Zabur is there. But they don't rely on these essences for their meanings, because they have lost the systematic approach to studying them. What they rely on is their rabbinic interpretations and commentaries. That's what they rely on. It is the same as Muslims only taking the tafsir, but not going into the investigative process of, is this what really the tafsir is saying? Is there a connection here? Or just taking a translation, or taking someone's interpretation. Interpretation is a lower science, it's not a higher science. But you have all these people, they will go out there and derive their own interpretations from the Quran. And this is where you get all these different ideologies coming up in a progressive interpretation of the religion. Feminism in Islam, LGBTQ rights in Islam. Where are these things coming from? They're using the Quran, and they're using English translations to derive their interpretations. They're using English translations to derive interpretations and then apply those as hukm. And you can't do that. You cannot derive rules and sharia from somebody else's interpretation. You have to go through the sciences. And these requisite sciences have been preserved. They have been preserved. And part of these requisite sciences is the sciences of the language itself, of which there are 13 that are being taught today. There are actually much more, that most of the sciences have been lost. 13 different sciences, of which lugha is a very minor science, the language itself. You have to learn grammar, you have to learn logic, you have to learn rhetoric, you have to learn articulation, you have to learn speech, khatib, you have to learn poetry and metric and prose, you have to learn traditional literature. How did those Arabs write at that time? How did they reason? How did they articulate? All these things have to be learned before you actually go into interpreting the Quran. So it's a very dangerous thing to go into the Quran to interpret and then preach what you are interpreting. You have to learn at least the very basic of Arabic to know exactly, at least for yourself, to know what is Allah telling me. So that when you look at the tafsir and the different tafsirs that are there, you can get an explanation of what the mufassir is saying about what this word means and what does that word mean and how does it relate to you. So that when you're reciting the Quran, just your normal recitation, your daily recitation, or when you're reciting in the salah, you know what you're saying. You're not just going through, the words. You know what you're saying, what you're reciting, so your focus is in there, is in the salah. It's in your attention is in what you're reciting. Otherwise, it's just lagwa. It's just words, which is where lugha comes from. Lugha comes from lagwa. It means just words, just speech, loose talk. And this is what a lot of people end up doing. Much of language, 80% of language is empty speech. It's just words, it's just gossip, nonsense. Laghawa means gossips. And this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in the Hadith prohibited from getting into empty speech, talking about things that don't concern you, that have got no relation to you. It's just words continuously thrown out there. It's just empty. The same thing applies. When you're reading the Quran, there is some sense of sakina in the recitation of the Quran. Undoubtedly, there is a power that Allah has put in the Quran. But that doesn't fulfill your obligation as a Muslim if you don't know what your Lord is telling you. What is He saying? Why is He saying that? When you understand the language, then you can understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. So inshallah, we're going to end there, and next week, inshallah, I think we will go into understanding what is revelation, what is the Quran as a revelation. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Yeah.
You touched on the thing that how certain things and concepts and principles have been, from the Quran, they were translated into English, and then interpretation will be taken as the basis. This is how the whole Bible would have been corrupted for. But as far as the Quran, it's just the translation, and it's the translation that has been taken. That is the first step. Now, let the institution of revelation. What does the Quran say about a Muslim marrying a non-Muslim? And the original Arabic, and then how that is translated into English, and how that English has been sort of massaged to the point that today a Muslim can say, we are here, yes, we can marry a non-Muslim. And that is happening everywhere.
Right. So the way the scholars do it is that they don't, unless it is very explicitly mentioned in the Quran, it is said do this or do not do that as a hukm, and the Quran is about a third of it is a direct hukm, and it's called Kitab. It is the heart of the Quran, and then there is mutashabiha, and those are interpretive elements. So unless it is directly specified, then the scholars will take that as the primary. Now, then they will look at what the hadith is saying. This is the epistemology of the Muslims. They will look at what the hadith is saying based on circumstances that occurred during the Prophet's time or explanations that the Prophet himself would give. And then they would derive and go into the fiqh aspects of it, which is the understanding of what that ruling means. I don't want to go into the ayat because it's going to take too long to explain. I mean, it's a weighty concept that you've just given. But the Quran does say that you're allowed to marry the Jews and the Christians. However, the Quran does not say that whether you're allowed to marry the Hindus, for instance. But the Quran does say, and the Mufassirin have elaborated, the Fuqaha have elaborated that you're not allowed to marry the polytheists, the idol worshippers. All right. So the Mufassirin concluded that this would include the Hindu. Now, there was a case that happened in India whereby a Muslim boy married a Hindu girl, and this was love. Of course, it was a love affair. So people are blind and make blind decisions in love. So, the condition that the girl's parents put is that, no, we're not marrying our daughter to a Muslim. You're going to have to convert into being a Hindu. And he did that out of either way, whether he didn't know what he was doing, because most people are not educated in the Islamic tradition. And he did that. So what ended up doing is that and this was not even a scholarly input at that point. It was just the Muslim League in India, I believe it's called. They ended up excommunicating him entirely. Or he's no longer a Muslim, he's an apostate. Because what they applied was the ruling of apostasy, which scholars in India, some scholars said that they shouldn't have done that, because he could have done that under necessity or under clouding of judgment or something of the sort. So the circumstance has to be understood when a ruling is applied to anything. A fatwa regarding any matter, the ruling has to be first analyzed in terms of what is the circumstance. You can't just apply an apostasy rule or chop off people's hands or cut off people's heads based on what the implicit or explicit meaning of the Quran is saying. For example, people who practice witchcraft or those who have an association with sihr and sorcery, they're supposed to be beheaded. But you can't just go around beheading people, especially when they don't even know what they're getting into. Most people end up regretting why they got into that kind of association, and they didn't know. And you can't just behead those people because they were ignorant of the matter. So in terms of what you were saying, in terms of people coming in, let's say, to Western countries and just, marrying non-Muslims, the circumstance has to be understood. What is the circumstance of marriage? And can you guide these people first before you impose punishment? Right? I said this before, that discipline is not punishment for crime. That's not what discipline is about. Adab is about proper guidance and nurturing and educating and teaching and raising. So it doesn't just apply to children, it applies to people as a whole. And the Prophet was very receptive. He did not hate people. Even when they continually bashed him and turned against him and, still committed these crimes, he showed his displeasure to even the munafiqeen in Medina. But he didn't, sever them completely, because when Iman would come to them, when Allah would end up putting guidance in them, nobody knows, right? So in terms of like what you're saying, yes, the rulings are there, and the different madahib have got different guidelines as to what you should follow. But the scholarly input has to be there. And when I mean scholarly, I mean scholarly. I don't mean Mufti Maulana. No, I'm not talking about fatwa. I'm talking about actual understanding of what should be done. Has to be done by an allama, an ulama, not just Mufti Maulana somewhere. because Mufti Maulana is based on what he studied in his education, in his Islamic education, based on which madhab he came from, or which institute he studied, what is his background. And this is something I'll explain later on when we come to understanding what the word Khalifa means. So, and these people, when they go in and start removing the translatives of the Quran, because people get frustrated. One person is saying this, the other person is saying that. Oh, you know what, brother, you should just, first of all, don't even pay attention to the hadith. This is what most people do. And this is the stupidity. They say, don't just pay no attention to the hadith, because some hadith are sahih and most of them are da'if. They are inauthentic. And this is their translation of what, And then they say, oh, the Jews put in their own fabrications of the hadith, so you can't trust the hadith entirely. So they say, only rely on the Quran. And then they go into the Quran, but they don't know the Arabic. How you study what the Quran is saying? So then they look at the translation. Now, if you look at the translations, you will find differences between Sahih International, Yusuf Ali, Dr. Mustafa Khattab, Pict Hall, Marmaduke. You'll find different definitions. Literally. They will all be saying the same thing, ultimately, essentially, but you'll have different words. Now, those different words, the specifics, the semantics, if you then look up the definitions in the English language, you'll find different definitions for it. So from one, you've got all these different attributes. And then comparatively, even though it's a synonymous word, you've got a whole bunch of different definitions from that. Now, if you're going to interpret a ruling of the religion based on that platform, then you are bound for failure. You're definitely going to go down the wrong path. Because never forget, because your intentions have already been made clear, Shaitan has an opening at that point. And Shaitan always plays with semantics. He cannot ruin a concept. Shaitan cannot change the concept of a thing. He will always play with semantics and confuse you in the semantics. So like I said, you can call this book, I can call it kitab, someone else can call it water. It doesn't change what this is. Water is a lie, because this is not water, right? But it doesn't change the concept of what this thing really is. This is what Shaitan will do. By using the interconnectivities in the words. Oh, this can mean this, and this is synonymous to this. This has a derivation here. This can also mean this. This has a connection into relation to this. If you look at the whole chain and compare the two, they are far from each other. Because now he will convince you via all that logical, flow that this is water. You can call it water. It's fine. See? In terms of things like marriage is an institution that it's divinely ordained. It is tawqifiyah in and of itself. Every concept, as far as the human being is concerned, is ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not just a natural instinct to get married, to be attracted to the opposite person and have a relationship and companionship. It's not just natural instinct. It's something that is part and parcel of the ordainment of the creation. Allah has created fi zawjain, in pairs, so that there is some sort of correlation between the two. Now, irrespective of where that individual comes from, their background, there can still be attraction between man and woman. And that attraction can be very strong. Of course, now in terms of getting into the marital contract, somebody would look at, okay, I'm a Muslim and you're a Christian. According to the Quran, we can marry each other. Right? There's nothing wrong because you're a good person, I'm a good person. We can marry each other. But we've got different practices and different ways of looking at the world. What do we do in this case? There are those who took very extreme stances and they would say, oh, especially for women, because for men it's okay according to the ruling that men can marry we can marry their daughters, right? But for our women to marry theirs, it's a problem. Why? Because the woman socially has to follow her husband's household, her husband's directives. You're part of that family now. There were cases where women would convert to Islam and their husbands would not be. They would be Christian or Jew. And these people would give rulings and saying, oh, you have to divorce your husbands. You could have done that before, but you can't do that now. Because what's going on in these people's minds? Like, what kind of religion is this? That I have to divorce my husband now? Now you've just lost somebody who was sincerely wanting to come into the religion, and now you've just shut the doors on them. There was a case that I heard from Sheikh Hamza Yusuf that he himself experienced, whereby the woman was converted to Islam, and then they didn't hear back from her. So when he found out later on, and he asked what happened, she said, oh, I changed my mind. So he asked why, and said that this is what they told me, that I have to divorce my husband. I've been married to him for 30 years, and now I have to divorce my husband. When Sheikh Hamza asked his teacher, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, he gave an ordinance on the matter, and he said, no, rather than going through the process of just cutting off family ties and breaking up the religion, because that's not what our religion is about. Allow it to take its time. Let her do da'wah, to her husband. And it worked phenomenally. Within 6 months, the husband became Muslim as well. So, you see, the reasoning behind this is that you could have lost 2 people to Islam, but because you used your reasoning and your aql in the right way, now you've gained 2 people to Islam, right? So, the understanding, the core understanding has to be, and Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya is a master of Arabic grammar. He's phenomenal in the Arabic language. So he's somebody who you would say is qualified to derive meanings and interpretives from the Quran. Every Tom, Dick and Harry can't just go into, we live in a society, kullu dabbin wa habbin, wa kullu habbin wa dabbin yatakallamun. Yatakallam. In English we would say the expression is like every Tom, Dick and Harry wants to string 2 sentences together and stand and give lectures and preach. It doesn't work like that. This is the society we live in. So you've got all these neo-atheists coming up on TED Talks and shows like this, and they're talking about things that they have no understanding of or no knowledge of, and it's not fair to people. It's ruining society. It's breaking families apart. It's not fair. Anyway, I think I went into a lecture instead of answering a question on that matter. But it's a very weighty concept, the question that you asked. It's not something that we can just give, 2 straightforward answers. It's something that really needs to be examined. Because the most complicated relationship of all, as far as human society is concerned, is the relationship of man and woman. You're 2 polar opposites trying to reconcile or to concile together with 2 different points of view and 2 different ways of thinking. It's a very complex relationship, right? Any other questions or comments?
अब ये जो औरतें सिखों से शादी करती हैं,
जी,
तो वो तो नहीं है जायज़। अब एक मेरे पास रेंट पे रहती थी, बड़ी हिजाब पहने हुए सारा कुछ, तो वो इंटरनेट पे कोई सिख मिल गया उसको, उससे बातें करते करते अब वो इतना नज़दीक हो गए हैं कि मुझे लगता है कि उन्होंने शादी कर ली है। मगर वो कहता है कि मैंने सिख ही रहना है, और जो लड़की है उसको कहता है तुम अपनाना चेंज करो। तो मेरे पास आई थी, मैं फिर उसको बोली हूँ कि तुम वो भी नहीं चेंज करेगा, वो भी नहीं करेगा, तो तुम्हारे बच्चे क्या होंगे फिर? तो इनके लिए क्या?
जी, ओके, मैं इंग्लिश में बोलूँ?
हाँ, बोलो, हाँ, समझ
जी, the thing here is that, and like I said, it's a very complex matter. I'm not qualified to give a ruling on this matter, and I'll not do that. Because I can end up misguiding and taking that the wrong way. But what I can give you is a concept on the matter, an understanding of what the religion entails. The religion itself it's very flexible and dynamic. It allows for different openings and different rulings to be applied. For someone like her, it is better that she consults with somebody who knows and understands these matters on a much more deeper level and not just a superficial level. What she needs is guidance, not fatwa, right? Because fatwa is ruling. It's a legal, do this or don't do that.
उसको बड़े लोगों ने समझाया, नहीं समझ रही
है. In terms of, because you see the whole situation will have to be analyzed as to exactly what is the circumstance behind it.
इतनी वो नमाज़ी फरेज़ी और स्पारा पढ़ाने मस्जिद में जाती थी मेरे पास रही है बड़े अच्छे तरीके से, जब निकली है तो स्कार्फ है, सारा कुछ है.
So in this case, you can see that there is an influence from the other side that is ruining her religion and her iman. So it is now upon her to make the right decision, because in this instance, there's only one of two things that she can choose: love for the man or love for her creator, right? And this is something that, like I said, she doesn't need fatwa on this matter. She needs guidance on this matter. So she actually needs to consult with somebody who will be able to guide her accordingly. Yeah. Any other question or comment? Anything? Okay. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.